Grace and peace, grace and peace, grace and peace be unto you. We thank God and we give you this grace and peace from our Lord, our Savior, our risen Redeemer, Jesus, the living Christ. I am the Reverend Dr. Kevin D. Miller, and you have tuned into Conversations with a Pastor. I am so very grateful that you thought enough of God and of us to spend this time with us today. As many of you know, Conversations with a Pastor is an opportunity for us to share critical and vital information to inspire your thought, to encourage you on your journey, and to help you do your activist work within your community. So each week we have a guest with us to have this conversation, and I'm just very grateful again to have you join us today for this conversation. Our guest today is Dr. Morrey Davis, a good friend of mine, someone who I've known for 2 decades. It's really been a minute. So I'm grateful to have him here with us today. He is a graduate, and he will correct me if I get it wrong, but he is a graduate of Holton College and University in upstate New York. He is also a graduate of Drew University, where he earned his master's degree and his PhD degree, and then went on to work at Drew for really almost 2 decades. He is the former academic dean and also the former associate professor of history, the son of Methodist ministers, someone who has spent his life a trained historian on so many different issues, particularly the United Methodist Church. And we're grateful to have him here with us today. He is currently teaching virtually for Cornell University, teaching some classes there, and really enjoying a wonderful time, retired life down in North Carolina. So I'm just excited to have him here with us today. He is also the author of Methodist Unification, Christianity, and the Politics of Race in the Jim Crow Era. So I invited him here today, and I'm so grateful to God and to him that he thought enough of God and of me to accept the invitation to be here with us today. Dr. Davis, how are you?
I am well. That's quite the good introduction. I appreciate that, my friend, Reverend Dr. Miller. It's really good to see you again.
Now, I am glad to see you. I am grateful to you for so many different things. I'm certainly grateful that you thought enough to accept this invitation today. We have known each other for some time, and I don't know if you owe me a fish taco or I owe you a fish taco, but at some
I think I owe you.
Well, then we got to find a way to make it happen. I got to make my way down to North Carolina so we can enjoy that lunch and that fellowship. Our viewers don't know, but Dr. Davis, and I'll go between Dr. Davis and Morrey because we've known each other for so long, but he is somebody who is a person of deep faith, and at many times, and a few times in particular in my journey, he has been a person that God has put in a place of support for me. So I am always going to be in debt to him for his kindness and for his support, and always being willing to check up on me beyond the responsibilities of what I would do at Drew Theological School. So I'm always going to be in his debt, and certainly grateful to him. For those who are viewing, you may have tuned in last week. We had as our guest the Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, who is the pastor of Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And in that conversation, we talked in great length about the birth of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was that conversation that really led me to reach out to Dr. Davis to ask him some questions, to ask him to be a part of this conversation. So as we start this time together, first of all, I just want him to not only greet us, but say a little bit about what brought him into this place of studying history, particularly through the lens of the United Methodist Church. And then we'll get into some of this conversation as it relates to the birth of the AME Church and the tension that was going on at that time. So Dr. Davis, say a little bit about this journey. What brought you into this place of curiosity in terms of history in the church?
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And I hope you'll call me Morrey the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, we're all in for that.
I'm really honored to be asked to do this. I really appreciate it. It's pretty easy for me to say how I got to what I studied in graduate school. It's very directly related to my upbringing, to my life in the Christian world, the way I was raised. And so that was definitely directly on my mind when I decided to go to graduate school and keep studying the history of Christianity. My parents were missionaries to Zambia when I was young. I was there for most of the 70s. My parents went when I was about 4 years old, and then came back here to North Carolina. But that re-entry back into North America, that re-entry back into the white world that is the United States, and especially the sort of white dominated church world that I came to, was a bit of a shock to me. And I don't think I ever really recovered, because it never really made sense. And so one of the things that I knew I wanted to do as I went through college and then decided to go to graduate school and was address some of those questions that haunted me when we came back, which was that the responses to my questions, when I said, I don't understand why we're going to church back here in America and everybody's white, the answers I got back didn't fit and didn't make sense to me. And so those incongruities, those dissonances really have haunted me since then. And that's one of the main questions I had then when I went to graduate school, is trying to figure out this thing that I had grown up in, that all my family was a part of. As you mentioned, both my grandfathers were Wesleyan revivalists. My parents, of course, as I said, went to Zambia to be Wesleyan missionaries. We don't need to get into denominational differences between the Wesleyans and the Methodists, but they're very close. As the original Wesleyan said, they were the true Methodists. But then everybody thinks that's true about themselves, right? But anyway, those questions really drove me and my work in grad school and then into my teaching as well. And the honest truth is that those questions have just become more and more difficult as time has gone on. The more I've taught, the more I've read, the more I've researched. There's no good answers to most of those questions yet. And I think all of us living in the United States, what we've witnessed over the last year or so would make that point even more profoundly. And that is that in the United States, white Christians have some struggling to do, right? There's some work to be done amongst white people in churches. And I'm not saying they're the only ones, but there's some hard questions to be answered amongst white Christians. And a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about today, and that is telling your story straight. It still doesn't happen, right? Yeah. When we tell ourselves stories, and when we tell the story of who we are, whether that be of our own little congregation, or whether that be the story of the United States, or whether that be the story of Methodism, and the way in which this particular story, let's just use this example, the 1787 walkout in St. George's, the way that story gets told, it tells a lot about what people are willing or not willing to say out loud. And for the most part, white people are not saying the story out loud the right way yet. And I think Christians in America and this country are going to suffer and continue to suffer and go through things they don't understand until they can say, this is actually who we are and we have to confront it, rather than what I keep hearing over and over again, which is, this is not who we are. Where did this come from? Right. To me, that's where we are. And it really goes back to how it is that we tell the stories of our origins. And until we're willing to tell them a little straighter, a little more directly, a little more honestly, then we're still in trouble. So that's how I got to it, and that's where I am. It came directly out of my own life experience, and it's been a wild few years. I'm out of the classroom for the most part now, but happy to be doing this kind of thing more. I hope. I enjoy this.
Well, Morrey, you said earlier on that one of the things that drove you is that you came back, you were in this place of worship, and you said it didn't make sense, right? Yeah. It didn't make sense that it was I guess this collection, this gathering, this congregation, what you were seeing, feeling, experiencing, it didn't make sense. And you also mentioned 1787, where you had the AME Church, the birth of it, came out of this moment where you had Black people in St. George's Church, and they get up and they walk out. I appreciate you pushing this point of saying we need to tell the story straight. And in telling the story straight, what would be helpful to me, and I believe for some of our viewers, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the influences, some of the impulses that were around that moment. For many people who are AME, it begins with Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and some of those Black people, not all, but most of them, getting up and walking out to create a new trajectory of ministry, of denomination, of Christianity. But what leads to that kind of moment? What were some of the impulses going on at that time?
Yeah, I listened this week to to Dr. Kelly's interview, and he had a couple really important points that are worth repeating. And that is, if you just think about the physical space of Philadelphia and the year of 1787, that is exactly when the brand new country of the United States, and in that city, where these big questions about who is a citizen and who counts as a person were on the table constitutionally. And so the timing of the walkout at St. George's is absolutely connected to the broader conversation. It's not really about representation. Again, it's the kind of language we use to tell the story. It's really that the so-called founders of the United States were deciding who was a full person and who wasn't. Mm-hmm. And that's not a policy question or a political question, right? Sure. This is a very, very deep kind of question about what it means to be a person and how it is that you recognize who else is a full person and what you understand yourself to be in relation to others who are different. Absolutely profound questions about what a person is and what it means to live in a world created by a God, right? And then who that God would be if we lived in a world where some people were fully human and some people weren't. Those are the questions on the table. And there's no way to understand what Richard Allen led without understanding that he knew that was happening, right? That they all knew that question was on the table, and that they recognized that white Methodists were leaning in one way on that question. Dr. Kelly also talked about the early stance of Methodists on the enslavement of humans. And yes, in 1784, they said no good Methodist should own slaves. By 1792, they had already backed off that question. Right. They'd already reprinted it. So that's the larger context, and I'll put it in two ways. One is these questions around a nation and who was being counted as a full person and a citizen. And then two, how that translated into churches as they became organized, as they became more centrally organized around forms and polities that were recognizable from Europe. So let's take Methodists, because we're talking about them. They're really the best example of this. The reason you have white and Black people in Methodist congregations is because Methodism wasn't a church at all before 1784. It was revival meetings, it was society meetings, it was class meetings, it was Bible studies, it was singing, it was all informal, much of it outside, right? It was this revival move in the middle of the 18th century that eventually became organized denominations. And when it was more informal, there was a lot more diversification, including gender diversity, right? So women were in charge of many of these small society meetings. Women led Bible studies. Women preached because there was no one telling them they couldn't. But as you get to a denominational structure, then the old patterns of authority began to take hold of that organizing, and you begin to see what you hadn't seen before that, which was a more official boundary, right? Building boundaries about who was in charge, who could be in charge, and it was based on these same questions that were happening at Constitutional Hall, which is who's a person and who isn't, or who's a full person and who isn't. So there's that big mix going on. Also, obviously, the question of human enslavement is on the table. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that Southern plantation owners are saying we need to keep these people in our capture, but also that Northern white people were making a lot of money off of it too, right? It's not just that it's a North-South question amongst the white folks. It's that in the Southern United States, enslavement was direct. In the northern part of the United States, white people were making a lot of money off of direct slavery. So everybody was benefiting. Right?
Say a little bit more about that, Morrey, because that's a nuance that escapes the conversation, right? When you talk about money and finances, say a little bit more about that piece there.
Well, let's just look at what it takes to run a farm, right? And then what happens to farm products. So let's say you're a Southern plantation owner. You have 400 enslaved people from the African diaspora. They're either picking cotton for you, or maybe sugarcane, depending on where you are, maybe tobacco at some point. Somebody has to buy that. Somebody has to ship it. Somebody has to provide the implements to farm it. Somebody provides the markets in which it's traded and bought and sold, and then somebody has to ship it, right? Most of the farm implements were made in factories in the North. Most of the cotton mills that made clothing were in the Northeast. The ships that were built to ship it to other places were primarily from the North. And all of this stuff was traded in the commodities on Wall Street, right? Well, what we're now calling Wall Street, but what eventually became Wall Street, right? So by the time you get, as an example, to give you a firm number, a lot of historians will say that by the 1850s, 70 cents on every dollar was made by enslaved labor was profit on Wall Street. So that you can't just say, well, this was a question of people who owned slaves or people who decided to participate directly as enslavers and those who didn't. It was everybody's making a lot of money off of this, and some people can act like it's, you know what I mean? So when you get to the 1850s, and most of the white people in the United States are more upset at the agitating abolitionists than they are at the people who actually own humans, then you begin to understand that most people are kind of happy with the status quo. And that's the real, when you start talking about money and where it goes, then you begin to understand that, slavery as a system benefited almost all white people in one way or another. It's very hard to find clean money. And so to be even more direct, when you start talking about white churches and those who participated in the enslavement of people and those who didn't, it's also hard to find a big church in the North that didn't make money from human enslavement, right? Even in New York City, the big city churches that have huge endowments, and the ones in Boston and the ones in New Jersey, right around where Drew was founded, that money came from markets, and those markets made a lot of money off the enslavement of the African diaspora. So when I say the money, I mean it. As almost always, the money is the place where things really begin to show and people begin to show their colors. And that's the same question in 1787. It's not, the debate was not so much, well, we think human enslavement is wrong and this other side thinks human enslavement is fine. It's how many representatives do I get in Congress and how many do you get? I would put it in those terms. I wouldn't put it in abolitionist versus pro-slavery terms. But I mean, we could talk the finance question on and on and on, but it is definitely not how you hear about the story of America when you take it in public school still, right? That's not really the story we still tell ourselves.
So even when you look at 1787 and the walkout, one of the things that that over time has really been put in context, and you said you watched the conversation with Mark Kelly Tyler. One of the things that he points to is that it's a 30-year period really between the walkout and the formation of the church. And a lot of times, if you're watching a movie, time passes very quickly in 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
But through a historical lens, to think that that there was this ongoing struggle between the Methodist Church and those who later were at the foundation of the formation of the AME Church. There's an ongoing struggle between the two. Perhaps you could say a little bit more, because I think about it, and there's almost this sense of white entitlement or Christian entitlement, you pick the term, in terms of almost how dare you walk out and take your money and start something up. You are supposed to be here with us and kind of be in your place, in your station, and just kind of just follow along. So there's that tension there. I would love to hear a little bit more about the history around that kind of season, that tension.
Yeah. Well, as anyone probably in the AME or any other Methodist affiliated denomination knows, is you can't take your building with you if you leave, right? It's not your building. Yeah. So in Methodist polity, for viewers who aren't familiar, the denomination owns the building. And so it wasn't so simple as we're going to go start our own church and have somebody preach in it. The polity of Methodism from the 18th century and Wesley's years was the connection owns the building, and the connection gets to say who preaches in the building. So there's no other levers of control you really need, actually, if you want to talk about whose church is whose, right? So that was definitely part of the 30-year debate, and why the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania had to step in. And really, Dr. Kelly's right. Such an amazing moment when the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania says, no, this belongs to Richard Allen and others. This is their building now. Anyway, so that is part of the story. There was definitely property involved. but also, as you say, just aspects of needing to maintain control, wanting to keep congregations large, not wanting to lose people. When you watch the conversations amongst white Methodists from 1784 into the 1830s and so on, and how so quickly the conversation around enslavement changed, it's as they move into the South and are looking to build and become bigger, and to be the biggest denomination in the United States. And it was a dream of white Methodists to be the biggest and the most influential denomination in this new nation. And so one of the ways to make that happen faster was to make it easier to become a member. It's just that simple. And so they're thinking big. And nothing wrong inherently with thinking big, but the ways in which they decided to make it possible for people to join, in retrospect, are pretty awful to watch. But that's what happens in those 30 years. They're fighting over how to keep the church as big as possible. And if you look at the different moments in amongst the mainline Methodist Church, so the white dominated one, any splits are always complicated by this desire to remain big. To put it in context, in 1776, so at the beginning of the revolution that became the United States, Methodists were maybe 2,500, 3,000 people, which is a very small fraction of the Christian population of what would become the United States. And so they were way down on the list. The largest groups were Episcopalians and Presbyterians and so on. But by the time you get to the 1850s, the two revivalist denominations dominated the American landscape. Methodists and Baptists made up almost a full third of the American population. And so they were very aware of that kind of contest, that they were going to be bigger and so on. So it's a lot of what we watch in this time period is a conscious institutional desire for big growth. And in some ways it was big growth at almost any cost. So think about, I think the two of you talked about 1787 as a kind of Black Lives Matter movement for Black Methodists in the United States. But it's the opposite for white folks, because not only did they not address abolition in a direct way, white Methodists actually outlawed the discussion of abolition in the 1820s and 1830s because they didn't want to divide the church. They didn't want them to split. So they said, most conferences, you can't even talk about it. Wow. So it's an amazing thing to watch in the history of the church, for sure.
Now that kind of leads us into the area, I guess, after 1787, after 1816. Your book in particular begins to outline a lot of what took place kind of in that time when you talk about Methodist unification and talk about the struggles with Jim Crow, and you even make reference to the birth of a nation versus the birth of the church, right? And what all those different things mean. What, in those moments, where do you see perhaps Christianity in general finding its way and losing its way as we try to get to a place where I believe God wanted us to be, and we rejected that in some form?
Well, thank you for asking about that book. That was a few years of blood and sweat, so it's nice to have people remember that it still sits there. But the book really is about a moment when, and the book is about the largest body of the two largest bodies of Methodist denominations. I mentioned the AME and the CME and the AMEZ briefly in the book, but only as a kind of gesture to what could have happened but didn't. Right, so there was this several decades of talk of reunification of all Methodists, but the conversation with the historically Black Methodist denominations just didn't go anywhere, and that just tells you a lot about this moment in the early 20th century. But the two largest ones, the Methodist Episcopal and the Methodist Episcopal South, which had split before the Civil War. This question again about influence, about national influence, about Christianity representing the fullest expression of Christianity as a national church really drove their conversations around a merger. And the conversations hinged on one question, and it's the same question from 1787, which is, what is, and I'll use their language, like, what is the status of Black Christians and these Methodists who are amongst us? You also, in your conversation with Dr. Kelly, talked about those who didn't leave the main white-dominated church. And by the time you get to the early 20th century, there's still almost 300,000 African Americans in the Methodist Episcopal Church who did not go AME, who did not go to AMBC. And that's a sizable body of people. I mean, it was 300,000 out of about 6 million or 7 million. So it's a lot of people. But they fought very hard for what they considered their church, right? They weren't about to accept that this wasn't their church, even though many white Methodists tried to push them, tried to say, why don't you go home to your friends? I even would say to some of the leaders of the African-American community, you know, I'm sure they'd make you a bishop as soon as you got over there. You know, as soon as you went, I'm sure you'd be a bishop, that kind of thing. But instead, they looked, and Dr. Kelly also used the phrases, are you conforming or are you transforming? They looked all around to see what, you know, sort of stuck their finger up in the air to see which way the wind was blowing. And there was no indication that in the United States, the wind was blowing towards greater equality for African Americans. And not just African Americans. In the early 20th century, you begin to see serious racist laws against immigrants from Asia, particularly from China and then later Japan. So it's a broad effort by white Americans to further instantiate themselves as the dominant force in the United States. So they understood themselves as the dominant race. And even in the church then, this became the primary energy around how these two big Methodist denominations would merge. And so what my book does, again, to get to your question, is it shows in detail how by the time they merged, the only way they could do it was to even further segregate African-American Methodists within the church. There was no progress in the early 20th century. They actually went back to make it even more segregated than it was before the 1860s. It's a stunning story in many ways to show that, you know, post-slavery era in the United States is one in which so many white people worked very hard to find other ways to remain the dominant group in the United States. And in the churches, the story doesn't get better. It's not a happier one. Right. And so that's really what the book outlines, is to show that one of the ways that church history has been taught is that, you know, there's a slow progression. The Christians have white people in particular, have slowly sort of figured out that the Bible really meant that all people are supposed to be equal and that God is the same for everyone. But that story isn't that accurate. And you don't fully understand contemporary events until you understand that the United Methodist Church, one of the largest denominations on the planet, was fully segregated until the 1970s. That's not that long ago.
That's right.
You know? That is not long ago at all. Those people who argued for segregation are still around. So that's what the book is about. But the book it's a history book, like all good history books should be. But it's a history book that says, how do we understand what's happening right now? Well, it's because this is who we really are. And it's one of those things that I keep pointing out white people in our conversation. It's one of those things white people have got to get their mind around, is how do we talk to each other about who we are and who we've been? And we still like to tell rosy stories. But, you know, it's like a person. It's like myself. I think most of us tell good stories about who we are so we don't feel bad about ourselves all the time, right? That's part of it. But it's also, right, you can't grow if you're not honest with yourself. Right.
I always want to tell good stories about myself. My queen will certainly make all the necessary corrections, all the necessary edits to my story, so I don't get too far off the path here. But
we all need a good historian with us and a good editor.
That's right. You raise a point that, as you were saying it, I felt something begin to rise up in me a little bit, and I'm bothered by the fact that it's rising up in me. And it is this concept of unification, and this concept that it has taken so long, and that's not even to suggest that we're there. You go back to 1787, and you have this split, and it's not just a split there, but you have a split on so many different levels, where you have different denominations being formed. I want to say, and I'll make sure I have this information and put it in the chat. I want to say it was 2008, where there was what they called the Great Revival, the Great Reawakening, where they tried to bring together the AME Church, AME Zion, and CME, tried to bring all three denominations together to kind of say, we're stronger together and we should be together, and the issues that we face are not different one from one denomination to another. So they had this one event in the South that was moderately attended, and we never heard again about that moment. But it raises the question around denominations coming together, even the times that we're living in now, in the same United States, right? That's supposed to be one nation under God has been completely split on a lot, and fractured on a lot of different levels. So I guess my question to you is this: when you talk about unification, and something that certainly is grieving me when I hear it and realizing that it does not exist, uh, where do you find hope through your historical lens and through your faith, that things can come together? Churches are still, are you know congregations are still splitting, churches are still splitting, denominations are still splitting. Instead of this great coming together, there seems to be this great ripping apart in some scenarios.
Yeah. Well, that's a very difficult question, and I have struggled with it for many years. And I'll be honest, and to any of my former students who might be viewing this, I often felt terrible that I was unable to offer up more hopeful classes or more hopeful answers to their questions. I got that one a lot. But being an historian or studying history, I think is also it's in some ways a humbling exercise, particularly around expectations of progress, which isn't to say that it never happens, but it is to say that there's not a lot of evidence that it's always going up, right? Another way to reduce this into something, maybe an aphorism, is I often tell students that history doesn't actually repeat itself, right? That's not possible. But people are kind of always the same. So while we may not see an exact replication of the 16th century and what Protestants have called the Reformation or whatever, we may not see something like that repeated. But people do behave in the same ways. People's motivations seem to be very similar generation to generation. It's as if we all have to learn the same stupid hard lessons every time, over and over and over again. We have a difficult time, it seems, as people accepting what wisdom or lessons might have been learned before us. It's like you tell a child not to put his or her hand on the stove, and then as soon as you say it, they're curious and they're going to have to put their hand on there and get burned. I often wonder if there's not just something in us that means we have to keep making some of the same mistakes over again. That's not a hopeless statement. That might just be one that lowers expectations to a little bit more reality. It doesn't mean that you work less for what you think should happen, or that you work with less intensity, or that you don't stop hoping that it will. But it is to say that we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And one of them is that we continue as people, and I think some are worse than others at different times. Privileged people, I think, tend to have more illusions about themselves. So I think in this case, in the United States, white Christians have a lot of illusions about themselves and about who they've been and sort of what they've represented and that sort of thing. And so I think part of the work that has to be done is the dismantling of illusions or self-delusion about who we are and what we've come from and what we've been capable of. So I think the last couple of years, and so I keep referring to that, but we all know what we mean. I mean, last year was tumultuous in so many ways, but the way in which race came so directly to the forefront of everyone's consciousness in the United States, just to me was a massive reminder of how much work we still have yet to do to talk about memory, and to talk about who we think we are and whether we think we're as good as we are, and that sort of thing. And the difficult part for me has been to figure out where to have those conversations and in what spaces. What is the right place for a conversation like that? I don't know where that is yet. And honestly, Kevin, it's part of my move out of teaching in the seminary world, to be honest with you. I don't know that institutions historically have been the best place, particularly white institutions, have been the best place to move things forward. Like, show me the big denominations that have really been at the forefront of great change. I can't, it's always too little too late. And we said we might not talk about United Methodist General Conference, but for me, it was difficult to continue to be in the middle of an institutional conversation that was still saying who's a full person and who isn't.
Sure.
Are we really still talking about there are some people not fully human? Right, we're back to 1787 in my mind, and there's an exhaustion to that for me after a while that I'm going to participate and try to be, what's the right word? Polite. Over and over and over again. Oh, we have to keep the conversation going. I don't know. At some point, you got to stop talking and just walk. I don't know. So is there hope? I don't believe that things don't change. I do think sometimes we need to reimagine what's the best space to try and pursue it. And I think I'm actually in the middle of that one, in a shift about where's the best space.
I appreciate the answer, and I probably just one more question, but I do want to say this, that your answer has given me hope, in the sense that your answer reminds me that once the seed of an idea is planted within a person, I don't believe that there's a way to diminish that. I believe that once these conversations begin to happen, that there is an opportunity, and I believe history demonstrates this, that if there are people that are committed in one generation, they may not see the fruit of their commitment. However, the generation that follows them, they begin to reap that. I mean, even when I talked about this gathering that took place, the good thing is that a gathering did take place. Somebody had an idea, somebody had a vision, and people still came together. And I, for one, I'm always thinking about that image now. I'm always thinking I'm not resistant to a gathering. I'm not resistant to this coming together. So I really appreciate what you said, because it's not easy work, and I think far too often we think it's going to happen very quickly, very easily, and I really don't believe that to be the case. That you need the right people with the right desire and inclination and spiritual insight and willingness to do the hard work and have the open conversation and to be very transparent. And all of that kind of leads me in some ways back to where we began, back to 1787, and the divide between the United Methodists, between the Methodist Episcopal Church and the AME Church, even up until this moment today. And just to ask you about points of reconciliation and ways that we can go from here. One of the things I've often been encouraged by is that there have been moments where I know the United Methodist Church now and the AME Church has come together for one thing or another, and you were a part of something that took place at that great theological institution called Drew, where the AME Church was celebrating its 200th anniversary. And those moments to me are not just historical moments, but they are cherished moments, because it reminds me that that perhaps there was a vision of how this was supposed to be. And as soon as people begin to talk about those things, that there is a possibility that we can actually be this inclusive church of Christ. So my question is about those kinds of moments of reconciliation, where you've seen them, how you've experienced them, and if not seen them or experienced them, then in what ways are you hopeful for them?
Moments of reconciliation. They do happen, right? They definitely happen. They only happen, I think, when there's somehow a lower defensiveness, especially on the part of whoever the dominant party might be, or whatever, that there has to be a sort of an openness and a vulnerability on all sides for reconciliation to happen. And I've said it a couple times already in our conversation, but there has to be truthful storytelling, right, about how everybody got here. And there has to be a kind of common vision, or a common honesty about what's possible and about what getting together is for, right? Reconciliation is not to make everybody feel better. That often so take one of the most important reconciliation movements of the last couple decades, and that would be what happened in South Africa, in their Truth and Reconciliation system or process. That wasn't fun for anybody, right? There wasn't some great emotional moment at the end of it where everybody said, "Oh, now we all love each other again," or whatever it is. That was just about hard truth telling for the most part, and an amazing community-wide or nationwide recognition that there was never going to be change in that very broken community without truth and reconciliation. Truth first before the reconciliation.
Right.
And so, in other words, there is no reconciliation where there remain large-scale illusions about how everybody got there. And there's a lot of fear at the very core of difference, and I think that shows up in the way that race has played such a big part in the formation of American communities, and that is the fear of losing of something, fearing of losing what you have, the fear of not being who you have been told you were your whole life, or whatever that thing is at your core of your identity. People don't talk past each other because their brains don't work. People talk past each other because they're so afraid to hear certain things, and they just keep re-narrating the story. So I think it happens on the institutional level too, right? There has to be an institutional vulnerability. You can't go into a conversation about reconciliation if you're not willing to lose what you have. And that, I think, is my primary historical lesson, is it's not very often when you get a lot of people who are willing to lose what they have for something better than what they got.
Wow. Morrey, thank you. Thank you for the insight, for the wisdom, for the feedback, for the transparency. A lot of times we have conversations and we're not transparent about the issues, and we're not transparent with our vulnerability. So I appreciate and I'm grateful that you were willing to do that with me today. And I said it at the beginning of this, and I want to say it again before I offer a word of prayer. And I just offer my thanks to you. I've said it in different ways at different times, but you have been a gift and a blessing to my life and to my family for so many different reasons. But in particular, some of the more difficult moments, you being there has really been a steadfast presence, to know that somebody had me on their mind in an intentional kind of a way, even when I was unaware of it. So I just want to say thank you to you. And if you would allow me, I just want to offer a word of prayer for you and for your journey. And then I want to share your information again with our viewers. Gracious, loving, and wonderful God, we thank you for this time. I thank you for my friend. I thank you for Morrey. I thank you for his family, for his sons. I thank you for his journey, for all that you continue to do in him. And I pray, God, that you would continue to order his journey, order his steps, continue to inspire his influence to so many of us. Just continue, God, to be just ever present in his life, not wanting for anything, but certainly through his historical and his curious lens, continue to be inspired to do more for those who he comes in contact with. So continue to bless him, his family, keep him and his family for your glory and for Christ's sake. Amen.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, my friend. Hold on for 1 second. I want to share your information with those who are watching in case they want to get in touch with you to learn more. Beloved, today our guest was Dr. Morrey Davis. He's an historian and author. You see his information there if you want to reach out to him, morrey.davis@gmail.com. In addition, in the chat, you will see information about how to reach out, not just to reach out to him, but also to learn more about this book that we were talking about. I would invite you to spend some time with this, spend some time looking at Methodist unification and looking at this question of race in the Jim Crow era. It is an excellent read, excellent information about what was going on in Christianity during this time. So I extend an invitation to you to do that as well. As like so many ministries today, we want to let you know that if you want to get in touch with us, we are worshiping virtually. You can certainly join us every Sunday on our Facebook page at 11 a.m. for worship. You can email us at cartercommunityame@gmail.com, and you see the telephone number there as well. We also invite you to visit us on our YouTube channel to find this conversation and any other conversation that we've done. There is a wealth of information there, and all of our guests have been willing to be in contact and share information to help you get more information about whatever it is you're asking about. So again, I want to thank you for being here with us this week. It has been my blessing to share this time with you. And it's my hope that through God's grace, you will choose to join us again. So thank you for joining us for Conversations with a Pastor.